All right, we will go ahead and get started. Thank you, everybody who is able to join us. My name is Dr. Bing. I'm the director of the LGBTQ Plus Resource Center here at Virginia Tech. I do just want to thank our co-sponsors for this event as well. That is the American Indian and Indigenous Community Center. I deeply apologize for that. And El Centro, who have been able to co-sponsor with us for this event. We're very excited to host Rob Nelson. I'm going to read their bio, and then I'm going to get out of the way so you can have a great time. So Rob is Lipan Apache, and their ancestors are of the San Luis Potosi Nahuatl people. Rob identifies as trans, working class, Latinx, and Chicanx. They hold a master's degree in theology studies with a focus in religion, ethics, and politics from Harvard Divinity School. While at Harvard Divinity School, Rob was a founding member of the Religious Anarchist Collective and worked for the Religious Literacy Program. Rob also learned a BA in religion and history from the University of Rochester and an AA in humanities and social sciences from Monroe Community College. Their academic interests focus on the development of American religious identities, constructions at the intersections of race, gender, and sexuality. Rob also has a passion for campus and community programming that engages these points of intersection. In January 2020, Rob was awarded the Promising New Professional Award from the Consortium of LGBTQ Higher Education Resource Professionals, which is when I got to meet Rob. So, folks, it is my absolute honor to introduce Rob Nelson.
Thanks so much. I appreciate that intro. We gotta shorten that, though, I think, Dr. Bing.
Too humble.
I appreciate that. I'm so excited to be with y'all. Danjo, Shi'i Onee, Shi'i Rob Sanchez Nelson, Shi'i Ji'i, Inde Hlepe, Ncha Shika Onja'a, Shi'i Insutsun, Ndee, Shi'i Inklada, Bide. Njada Ndee. Hello, my friends. I'm Rob Sanchez Nelson. I come from the Little Breech Clout and Big Water bands of the light gray people, also known as the Lipan Apache. As you heard Dr. Bing say, my ancestors are also Nahuatl from San Luis Potosi, that region of Mexico, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm using the name of my ancestors today, and in doing so, I invite them to walk with me in a good way as I do my work. Among many of the indigenous communities of Turtle Island, it is expected that when you introduce yourself, you also name the generations of ancestors that came before you. And as you can imagine, this actually takes quite a long time, so you're welcome. I have saved you that time and shortened to my list of ancestors. I will end my introduction in the way that my people, the Ndee people, commonly in their introductions, and that is to say, Shi'i Inklada Bidee Njada Ndee. These are my ancestors who the sun rose with long ago. Before we get started on our actual talk, I want to make sure that we do our land acknowledgement. And if I was in person there on campus, I would lay down some tobacco or some pine cones or something from my ancestral homelands in giving something to the land. But as we are not able to do that, I will do that with words and acknowledge the indigenous folks' connection to the land of the area, both of Nashville and of the area that Virginia Tech resides on. I'll read through this, and at the end, I'll pause for about 10 or 15 seconds, and I invite you at that time to consider your relationship with the land. That could be where you currently are or reside, or maybe some land that has important meaning to you. But just consider your responsibility and relationship to that land. The Nashville Metro government occupies the ancestral hunting and traditional lands of the Cherokee, Shawnee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Creek peoples. Today, these people have nation boundaries in Oklahoma, North Carolina, and Mississippi after the Indian Removal Act of 1830 led to the forced removal of southern tribes to west of the Mississippi River. In particular, the city of Nashville resides on land ceded in the Treaty of Hopewell. I want to also acknowledge the Tutelo, I think, Monacan people, who are the traditional custodians of the land in which Virginia Tech resides. In doing so, we recognize their continuing connection to the land, water, and air that Virginia Tech consumes. We pay respect to the Tutelo and Monacan nations and to their elders past, present, and emerging. I recognize and support Indigenous individuals and communities who live in the Nashville and Blacksburg area now, and those forcibly removed from their homelands. Collectively, we come together to also recognize the resistance, strength, and pride of other people of color whose ancestors worked, lived, and bled along on this land without benefit or due compensation. We stand as accomplices alongside you in the fight for equity. Thank you for taking those few moments to consider your relationship with the land. If you have any questions about what a land acknowledgement is, how to craft one, how I went about crafting this one, please either feel free to email me or stick around at the end, and I'm happy to talk about that process. And if you're interested in creating a land acknowledgement for your own space, I'm also happy to help folks through that process. Okay, so why are we here? Why does this matter, and why are we here? So today, we're here to talk about the ways that the systems of white supremacy use the gender binary to keep queer people of color detached from their history and their power, essentially. My hope is that in exposing the ways that white supremacy maintains binary frameworks of understanding and knowing, we can help break white supremacy. Now, in no way do I believe that this process of uncovering and reconnecting to our power will in itself end white supremacy. White supremacy is insidious and deeply woven into the entirety of modern Western societal structures. However, conversations like today's can provide some tools that we can use to break away small chunks of oppression and isolation. I will specifically talk about how non-queer and trans people of color can do some of this work as accomplices, in addition to focusing on how and why these efforts can be so important to queer folks of color. For me, as a queer and trans person of color, I've experienced the complex ways that the systems of white supremacy keep folks like me disconnected from my story, from my ancestors, from my power. Much of this work is as a direct result of my own uncovering process and decolonializing efforts. For you, if you're here today, then you likely already care about being a part of this conversation and dismantling systems of white suppression. A topic and title such as this does not often draw folks that have opposing views, unless, of course, they're here to troll us. And if that's the case, stick around for the Q&A because it will be interesting. My hope is that you will each take something from today that helps you in your own decolonializing process, or as you act in solidarity and aid in the dismantling of white supremacy. And for us, and by us, I mean queer people generally, simply this is really the only way we can liberate ourselves. Of course, how we do this, my hope is that will become clearer as we progress today. So let's get some understanding about the language of white supremacy. What are we talking about when we say white supremacy, to make sure that we're all coming at this from the same place? White supremacy is a historically based, institutionally perpetuated system. That system part is really important, of exploitation and oppression of continents, nations, and peoples of color by white people and nations of the European continent, for the purpose of maintaining and defending a system of wealth, power, and privilege, right? So there's a lot there. So it's a system really set into place by people with power to make sure that they can hang on to their wealth, power, and privilege. There are a lot of misconceptions, though, about the language of white supremacy. One, a lot of folks think that it is always intentional, and it's not. Sometimes it's not intentional. Sometimes we repeat normative language, not realizing the roots of the language or what it implies. We hold up white supremacy in our lives without really even realizing it. You can see evidence of this in the workplace and company policies and practices that perpetuate white supremacy around appearance and professionalism expectations that come down to, forcing folks of color to change their hairstyles or the way that they wear traditional garments or jewelry, right? And trying to force people to fit into the visual representation of white supremacy. Another misconception is that it doesn't commonly occur. And this is sort of tied to this idea that it's always intentional, right? It roots from the belief that white supremacy is only an action done by white supremacists and is only outward and obvious hate, and that's not the case. It it's a misconception that it's common, and that only hate groups practice it. But this misconception actually leads us to overlook ideas and norms and societal expectations formed by those with privilege to reify white supremacy. And I hate to tell y'all, but white supremacy is reproduced by nice people, and sometimes well-intentioned people, and people of any age. And similar to that, there's a belief that someday these things will just go away, right? That with the next generation, there's going to be a lessening of the systems of white supremacy, or that one day it'll just disappear. But it's, that's not the case. Folks of any age, of any background, are participating in systems of white supremacy, are upholding and uplifting systems of white supremacy. And so there's also an idea that, like, maybe when there's more people of color, that actually will be the shift, right? Maybe when there's more folks of color um, in the community or in a company, that will change the feel or the culture in a space. But that also isn't true. White supremacy is upheld by folks of color. So it's not just white folks that uphold white supremacy or that make sure that it's reified or rebuilt and sustained. Now, this misconception that it's only upheld by white folks, this topic, it could be its own talk in and of itself, right? So I want to acknowledge that this is a really layered and complex component of white supremacy that we could talk about for a really long time. However, we just don't have the time or space for that. And again, it sort of takes us off topic. But no system of oppression survives hundreds of years without convincing those who are oppressed that they are either safe, deserving, or benefiting from this system. So by the simple fact that white supremacy has been sustained for as long as it has to be able to convince the folks that it's oppressing that it is either best or innocuous enough that folks buy into it. So let's actually look at I have colonialization, imperialism, and assimilation up here. Those are other components of white supremacy. Often the language, especially of colonialism and imperialism, and assimilation too, I guess, will be used in place of white supremacy. So you might hear me say a lot of stuff about colonialization or decolonializing. And in that, I'm talking also about white supremacy. So that's why I have those up here. Okay, so let's look at the tools of white supremacy. So what are we actually talking about? I do want you to know that there are about 15 to 20 different tools or tactics of white supremacy. We're only going to talk about 4 today, and I encourage you to familiarize yourself with all of the other tools and tactics of white supremacy. I have some resources that I'll give you at the end that are both going to be helpful in your own exploration of this topic, but also in identifying and recognizing other tools and tactics of white supremacy. So, okay, so we're only going to be focusing on 4. So why 4 and why these 4? So really the main reason of only 4 is for the sake of time, right? I also would rather talk about the ways to break white supremacy. I'd rather spend more time talking about the ways we're going to break white supremacy than about the different types of white supremacy, right? I don't want to give my intention and my energy to that so much as I want to give intention and energy to talking about the histories and lived realities of queer and trans people of color. So that's the reason, time, and also where we're putting our intention. these four I picked because I really find myself talking about them the most, both with students and just with family and friends. I find myself saying, well, that's happening because it's a tactic of white supremacy, right? And pointing these things out to people. And so I'm most comfortable talking about these four specifically. But those are the ones I tend to find myself talking about. Okay, so let's break these down and think about these four tools of white supremacy. So the first one is perfectionism. And this equates making a mistake with being a mistake. So non people of color give little time and energy to reflect on learning or put resources into learning and growing from their own mistakes, because the idea is that they either don't have them or their mistakes are truly seen as mistakes and not a personal reflection. So if a white person makes a mistake, it's just a mistake. We all make them. But if a person of color or a queer person makes a mistake, it becomes applied to them as a person, right? It becomes something that's applied both to their body and their being, and then they in turn become a mistake. Adopting and embodying the expectations of your oppressor, that looks like taking on the ideals of toxic masculinity and ideal body expectations. And these are two topics that really impact the LGBTQ plus community with a lot of intensity. I've personally struggled with the toxic masculinity component quite a bit within the lesbian community. I myself was a practitioner of toxic masculinity, and to be quite honest, it took a lot of love and people around me pointing these things out and helping me see and uncover some of these things in the way that I was behaving. And I think it is getting better within the lesbian community. I think we, of course, still have a long way to go, but we adopt this idea of what white masculinity looks like, and we apply it specifically folks who would identify maybe as butch or aggressive. We apply it to ourselves. So we adopt those ideas of toxic masculinity being misogynistic and all about outward expressions of power and wealth, and the expectation of appearance and all of those things. We really take it in and absorb it and apply it to our lives and ourselves. And so that's what this means by adopting and embodying the expectation and or behavior of your oppressor. You see this too happen with ideal body expectations, and there's a lot of work being done right now around the prevalence of disordered eating within the LGBTQ plus community. And so this is definitely, again, something that we've taken in and adopted. And of course, disordered eating isn't exclusive to the LGBTQ plus community, but this idea of a perfect body expected to look like the ideal of white perfection is something that we take on and absorb, and it really impacts us as queer folks. It impacts us as people of color, and it sets expectations that we actually can never meet, right? And then it gets us into the system of, doubting ourselves, feeling like we're a failure, feeling like something's wrong with us. So this thing of perfectionism is really quite invasive and nebulous, and it's really connected to all of these things. So you might hear me refer back to the idea of perfectionism a few times. Okay, so the next one is expectation of comfort, which is the belief that those with power have the right to emotional and psychological comfort. And this is another aspect of this is like valuing logic over emotion. You can also manifest in that way. You see it manifest also in scapegoating those who cause discomfort. I hear this a lot in like, let's not get political, or let's not bring politics into this if we're in a neutral space, right? And sometimes you could just be talking about racism or white supremacy, and folks want to say, let's not bring politics into this. Or, in the work that I do, you talk about national or state policies that impact LGBTQ plus folks, and all of a sudden it's let's not get political. Well, it's impossible to separate political from my body when the state makes my body political, right? And so that scapegoating is applied to me as though I'm the disruptor. When I'm naming what is causing trauma, what is causing oppression, I become the disruptor. I become the person that's causing discomfort. And so you'll see oftentimes, folks feeling like they have a right to be comfortable in any space. And that is a tool of white supremacy, with the expectation that folks that have power, along with that power comes the right to be comfortable, and everyone else has to conform to those expectations in order to ensure that that comfort of white folks or folks benefiting from white supremacy stay comfortable. So that's expectation of comfort. The next one is right way thinking, which is the belief that there's only one right way to do things. And once people are introduced to the right way, they will, of course, see the light and adopt it when they do not, when they realize that they have been living in error, right? They'll see what's wrong with them, with what's wrong with their lifestyle or the way that they're living. This type of thinking has had a lot of different iterations. In the past has looked like, LGBT people should stop flaunting who they are and just realize that the way they live is wrong, and they need to just be straight. They need to just put it away, right? Just decide to be straight, and then you'll be okay. Your life will be happy, and you will be good. And if you don't adapt to that, then something is wrong with you. You are othered. We've seen this historically in the efforts of colonialization and the missionary work of imperialism. When the missionary does not see the value in the culture of community, in the culture of other communities, and sees only value in their own beliefs, and believe that their idea of what is good is a universal good, that if only people were enlightened to it, they would realize that it is good too, right? It is also the idea that everything that is not white, straight, and cisgender is other. And eventually those other people will realize their mistakes, live straight, cisgender lives, or also known as the American dream. And again, going back to the perfectionism, I told you I'd go back to this a few times. We adopt this into our communities of color, into the LGBTQ plus community. This idea that if you are conducting yourself as close to heteronormativity as possible, then you are right. You are performing an acceptable type of queerness. And if you're not, say, in a relationship that resembles heteronormativity, then you're living outside of the norm, and you need to get it together and really start to live an appropriately queer life, which essentially resembles heteronormative relationship structures. Okay, and the fourth one is worship of the written word. And this has a lot to it too. So I'll only touch on a few things, but if it isn't written down, it is invalid or deemed a myth. There is a preference to written or formal or professional English, and a disregard of other languages like Ebonics or AAVE. Even other type of languages that are not seen as valid languages like ASL. Because it's not always written down, it's a visual language, right? And this also leads into oral traditions, and not, this idea that if you can't cite an oral tradition, if you can't properly academically cite an oral tradition or an elder or a teaching or a belief, then it's just a myth, right? It's not real. It's not valid. And obviously we could get into the systems of power behind who decides what is academically suitable. or the academy's role in white supremacy, but and if this isn't obvious, it's huge. But that again is for a different talk. And then you might have picked up on this on the description for my talk today. I spelled history with an X, and here's the reason. History is viewed through the white conqueror lens. Thus, I write it as hxstory because indigenous and gender plural people are erased or crossed out of those histories. And until we're present in those histories, it can't be spelled history. I know it's a sort of visual representation or reductive presentation of that idea, but that's why I use the spelling of history in that way. Okay, so those are the tools of white supremacy. This is based on the work of Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun. Again, this will be a resource that I provide to you, but there's a lot of other tools and tactics, like I said before, of white supremacy that you really should familiarize yourself with, or at least have some knowledge of them. Okay, so that's white supremacy. I want to talk now about how we break that, how we break white supremacy, how we reclaim our histories. And I'm going to propose that we do it by decolonializing gender identities and reclaiming our histories. And I'm going to give you two examples of that. The first one is going to be in celebrating the Muxes, which is a community of indigenous folks in Mexico. And I will let you watch this TikTok. Hopefully you can still see this. And you're probably not going to be able to hear it. Let's see. Can y'all hear this?
No, but you might be able to adjust how the screen share is to use your computer audio.
Yeah. I'm going to stop my share here, and then I'll reshare it to fix it. Sorry, y'all. Okay. All right. Hopefully, y'all were able to read all of that. And learn a little bit about Muxes. I will tell you, there's a lot of videos and documentaries out there about this community in Oaxaca that they have. They do not speak Spanish. They do not have gendered language. There's a lot of information about them out there, and this is a community of people that are living and thriving in areas of Mexico currently. All right. I don't know. I see that we're getting questions, but I don't know if they're relative to what we're talking about right now, and maybe we want to wait to do. We didn't talk about this thing. If we want to wait to do a Q&A at the end.
Yep, that works.
Okay. All right. So the next thing that we're going to look at is a reading done by Lady Dane. So if you're not familiar with her, she's a phenomenal poet and writer. She's got a few books that, again, on the resource page that I have for you, you'll have her information on there. But part of the work that she does is looking at different ancient cultures and and seeing the ways that gender existed prior to colonialization, and revives those as a way of reclaiming sacred space for trans folks. So her work is really beautiful, and she's a phenomenal artist. So I encourage you to check her out. I'm gonna set up what she's doing because I don't want to play the whole thing for us because it's long. So she was invited to do a piece, record a video for artists, to raise money for artists struggling during COVID financially. And so her video was posted and people donated in order to watch her video, and then it was posted on YouTube, and so that's how we're going to watch it. And so her idea was to read a story about comfort, and she sets this up in saying that, you know, one thing that brought her comfort when she was young was when her mom would read her a bedtime story. And so that's what she wanted to do. She wanted to read a story of comfort for artists and queer folks of color. And so that's what she's going to do for us. So let's pause this. Hold on a second.
Especially for, you know, any, you know, trans folks out there, any intersex folks out there, any gender non-conforming folks out there, please know that you have an amazing sacred place in the history of the world. So, let's get to it. Oh, I gotta find it first. All right, here we go. So, if you have your books open, if you already own the book and you're watching this video, go on, turn in your hymnals. That's what they say in church. Go on, turn on your hymnals to page 33. And this piece finds itself in a section called Mythos, a play in one act. The prologue. In the beginning. In the beginning, there was no gender. There were no pronouns. There only was the Great Spirit, Goddess, God, the universe, birth, awareness, and it was good. Good. Divine eye opened, divine being could foresee limbs that were not limbs begin to dance, and all that was, and all that is. Now, time tells all tales and shifts from one awareness to the next, and the music of the one became the symphony of many. And as world formed and stars became the mothers of planets, we sprang. Our hips, our lips slip into the mouth of being, become daughter change. In those first days we came to wake, came to make a short due. The mothers of creation were we. The fathers, beloved of mother, the mothers, beloved of themselves, held us high in heaven's esteem. The world gleamed, the one, when we walked into being. How beautiful, how wonderful, how true. World, now, heed this warning. Give us our due. Give us our due. Give us our due. Act 1. A black trans girl saves the world. Back in Sumer, in olden days, there was a goddess who owned everything. Anana was her name, queen of heaven. They say she grew bold and realized she ain't owned death. Beautiful and buxom, Miss Anana gathered her 7 emblems, marched her behind to the gates of the underworld, looked back and said to her sister girl, her best friend, Diva, I'm about to go down to this here, get these underworld powers from my big sister real quick. If a girl don't come back in 3 days, go on to my 3 daddies and say what they got to say. Her sister girl proclaimed, gotcha, sis. So, Big Mama and Nana got to the first gate, and they were like, girl, them pumps is cute, but they gotta go. To the second gate, to the third, to the fourth, until the seventh. She was stripped of her royal emblems until she gets to her big sister, who set more.
All right, so I'm going to stop it there. This story goes on for quite some time, and again, I have it in the resources that I'll share with you at the end. But what I appreciate that she's doing is uncovering transness in historical communities that really were whitewashed and erased and seen as invalid. Most of these stories were not written in the way that we recognize written text today, and so a lot of them are forgotten about or erased. They were seen as corruptive, to learn or pass down, and so they've been lost. And a lot of the work that she does is to uncover those stories of folks of color and gender plurality being lived and fully embraced in different communities. So there's a few other, obviously there's more than a few. There's a lot of different global gender constructions, and the ways that gender identity is formed around the world is really, really diverse. And so I've picked a few out here that I'll tell you about. But I encourage you to do some of your own exploration in this, and I'll talk about how you can do that. So continuing with the Sumerian myth, which is what Lady Dane was reading us, we have the god Ninima. And I will say, I will probably mess up almost all of these pronunciations, but perfectionism is a tool of white supremacy, so we'll do our best, right? And my apologies if any of these are your communities and I absolutely messed them up. My apologies. Okay, so the god Ninima of Sumerian mythology is one person that you could look up, and that god is the god of change and water and those types of things. And then we have from Vedic culture, Titria Pakrati, which is a third nature. A third way of being, not necessarily gender, just a third way of being in early Vedic culture. We have Sipanik, which is an Inuit third gender identity that is frequently occupied by shamans within the Inuit religion. In India, we have the Hijra, and those folks in some areas of India are really revered and celebrated, and in other parts of India, they're shunned and actually experience a lot of violence. And so it really depends on where you are in India. There's actually a specific festival just centered around the Hijra, and they go through a ceremonial marriage to one of the gods. And it's a holy day, and there's a lot of festival and a lot of different ceremonies that happen around it. So it's really interesting if you're curious about the Hijras. In Hawaii, we have the Mahu, which are fluid or dual-spirited indigenous Hawaiians, revered, and often they are educators or healers in communities. And again, there's a lot of good documentaries on the Mahu out there, but essentially these were third gender folks that occupied a middle space that could teach young people about the fluidity of gender. And it was this idea that if you were taught the fluidity of gender, that you would come to know your own gender more securely, or more be more aware of all of your components of your gender and how you exist in the world. And when colonialization happened to the islands of Hawaii, the Mahu people were essentially given over to colonializers, and essentially were killed. And that's something that happened in indigenous communities all over Turtle Island. That was a common thing. The colonializers would come in and say, give us all of your non-conforming people, and if you do, we'll give you gold, or we'll give you medicine, or we'll give you food, and then they would kill them. So a lot of history and knowledge and ceremony was lost. A lot of really important information that indigenous communities just absolutely lost. And so there's a lot of going through for other indigenous or all indigenous communities on Turtle Island of this reclaiming and reknowing process of two-spirit or third gender folks. But the Mahu is one community in Hawaii. The Bisu are a fifth gender that is acknowledged by Indonesian culture. Oftentimes, Bisu are priests or conductors of spirits, and so they lead ceremonies, they give blessings. They're often present at the birth of a baby and give an immediate blessing upon birth in order to pacify spirits and make sure that that baby is able to stay healthy. So they actually hold a pretty important role. Other parts of Indonesia actually have up to 12 different gender identities or gender roles that are all fluidly occupied, and it really depends on where you are in Indonesia. All right, we have in Pakistan we have, I'm gonna mess this up, y'all. The Khawaj Shira of Pakistan. They create their own family trees through a system of gurus and apprentices, and oftentimes they do this because they have to leave home, right? And so they then create their own family systems. We also have the Siket of Egypt. It's one of the oldest known examples of a third gender, and it's depicted on an Egyptian tablet of poetry from 2000 BCE. So while each of these communities have their own history, their own struggles with colonialization, it's important that we know what that looks like, right? It's important that we uncover the ways that white supremacy has, again, put that X over their history or through their history and essentially erased some of these cultures. We can reclaim some of these historical tellings, and in doing so, reclaim our power, essentially. So I'm going to leave y'all with a bit of a challenge. First, I want to recognize that you can fall into both or one of these categories. But if you're white and queer, you have your own history to uncover, your own process to go through as a queer person, but that doesn't exclude you from the need to learn about folks of color's history as well. And similarly, people of color who are not queer have their own process, right? And to learn about queer folks and queer folks within your own communities of color is really important. We all have overlapping and intersecting identities, and we need to understand how they all operate within white supremacy in order to truly break it. So my challenge for those of you who are either not folks of color or who are not part of the LGBTQIA+ community is to learn the stories and histories of Indigenous people, and specifically their understanding of gender and what it looks like today. I encourage you to put aside the whitewashed telling of history told from the view of the conqueror. We've talked about that. Moreover, I want you to share what you learn, right? Because it's not enough for you to just uncover and learn these things, but if you share it, that is actually the act that starts to break apart white supremacy, because we start to poke holes in this idea of perfection, only looking one way, or this only thinking one way, or thinking your culture is right and everything else is wrong, right? We start to poke holes in that the more we share the multiplicity of gender identity, the multiplicity of religion and faith and spirituality and ways of being in the world, we can start to break white supremacy. Make this a regular practice, and make it a regular practice to not just share stories, but also to name what you're doing, right? And name the places and where you see white supremacy happening, and all the manifestations of it. And as I said earlier, as you start to uncover some of these things, you'll start to see more of the connections. Essentially, as you start to pull away the curtains on one tool of white supremacy, you'll see other tools of white supremacy pop up, and you'll be able to more regularly identify those. So make that a regular habit to name it. And people will tell you not to name things, right? They'll tell you, oh, don't bring politics into this, or we're all getting along here. Can't we just be, or whatever? Be the person to disrupt. Be the person to disrupt the expectation of comfort. Because folks of color and queer folks never have the expectation of comfort. They're expected to conform. So be the person that disrupts that idea that one group of people gets the expectation of comfort and nobody else does. To my QTBIPOC comrades, I encourage you to write, sing, tell, and know your own histories. Uncover the unending roots that bind you to your ancestors. Recreate what is lost. Hold on to what you find, and be you without compromise. Be who you are, and be in the process of becoming at all times. We're unfinished products, and this idea that we have to be a specific thing and we have to know what we are at a specific time or else we're invalid is an expectation of perfection, is a tool of white supremacy. So it's okay to not know who you are right now. We should all not know who we are right now. We should all always be in the process of becoming and uncovering who we are. I also encourage you to name systems without compromise that oppress you, that target you, that make your life more difficult. Name those systems of white supremacy, especially within our own communities, right? Within the LGBTQ plus community, we reify racism, we reify classism, we reify all of these tools of white supremacy that just keep our fellow community members further marginalized. We play into that. And so we can have a huge role in breaking that apart. And if we all do these things together, we can be the immovable force that ultimately starts to break white supremacy. Again, I don't have the expectation that we're going to do it just by uncovering plural gender identities, right? But it can be a component. It can be a piece of it. I will put in a chat. Can I put stuff in the chat box?
Yep, you should be able to.
Well, that's all the material that I have. So I'm going to stop sharing because I'm hoping that we can have, with our remaining time, a good Q&A. I see there's some stuff in the Q&A, so I'm happy to engage in that.
Absolutely. And the first question that was in there was about the presentation and if it will be recorded and posted. That absolutely will. There is a link in the Q&A that shows you where you can subscribe to that newsletter, and we will be sending that out. Thanks to Rob's great permission. Thank you for that.
Yes, of course.
But please do go ahead and use the Q&A function. You can also use the chat function if you're more comfortable with that to submit questions, and we'll spend some time doing that now.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's also a link to the TikTok, and there's a transcript of the TikTok in the chat specifically if you
awesome.
have requested that.
Thank you for that.
Of course. Here to help. While we wait for folks to submit questions, I'll stop being a headless voice. I read Michael Bronski's Queer History of the United States, and I remember just being floored that was the first time that I had seen queer history start with natives rather than with whiteness, and I was just so excited and thrilled. So if folks are looking for reading materials, that's a really good one.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't figure out a way to attach a file, so maybe I'll send it to you.
Yeah, absolutely. If you go to, are you able to open up the chat?
Yeah, it won't let me it won't let me attach anything.
Oh, that's cute. Yeah, send it to me and I will send it to everybody as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah, there's a trend in historical academic writing to there's a debate and a trend. So there's a debate as to where to start, right? Because oftentimes history is started at a moment of conquering the suffering natives, or the bumbling natives that were barely surviving until colonialists arrived, right? And so there's been a real shift lately of where to start that, and talking about Indigenous people, and doing so in a way that does show the plurality of gender. I don't think we've done a very good job of it yet, partially because Indigenous gender conceptions are quite diverse. The way gender is conceived and constructed will vary from tribal community to tribal community. So that's one reason, is that it's really hard, and the other reason is that we, like I said before, we lost a lot of it. Right? It was systematically erased by the murder of non-conforming people.
Absolutely. So we've got two questions. One, what are books, podcasts, or movies you would recommend on these topics?
So I will tell you, I literally have 3 pages of resources. That's the resource I've been trying to attach. That is, and maybe I'll just share my screen and show you it. But it's a bit extra. Sorry, I go a little overboard sometimes. But okay, all the time.
I love this.
But yeah, so we start out, I'll send this to y'all so you have all the links and everything. But the characteristics of white supremacy culture, that first one, that's where I got all of the information about the different types or trends in white supremacy. And then this zine that I put, this decolonializing gender curriculum and zine, is phenomenal, and I highly, highly recommend it to everybody. It's fantastic. And then we have a series of articles. You'll see my list of books is quite lengthy. Some videos, including the videos that I showed you today, a couple of blogs, which I actually struggled to find some blogs, so there's only 2. I'm not really into blogs, so I don't really have that natural affinity to them. And then a list of some podcasts. So like I said, I'll make sure that you get this and you can send it out.
Yeah, we will send it out with the recording, and that way everybody gets everything in a nice packaged email.
Totally.
Awesome. The second question is, actually it starts out not a question. Thank you so much. This is informative and empowering. I've been too well trained to research using academic sources. Any general tips for reorienting research strategies to find other voices? Looking forward to checking out the specific resources you recommended.
Yeah. So in grad school, I did my master's thesis using all primary sources from underground communities, and they were all essentially zines. So I think a lot of people forget about zines, and if you're not familiar with them, then you probably don't think about them to go to for resources. And sometimes, I mean, not every zine is usable as a resource, right? That by their nature is an expression of personal experience. But if you're looking at the ways that people conceptualize things like religion or gender identity, zines are a fantastic place to find those things, right? And you'll see the way that people are grappling with heteronormative ideals and themselves and how they fit into those things. So I encourage you to check out zines. Podcasts are always really great. All my relations is a really great podcast that talks specifically about the diversity amongst Indigenous folks, specifically of Turtle Island or North America. And there's a lot that they dive into around gender identity and a lot of other things. So if you're looking for a good podcast, that's a good place to start. But I'd start with zines and podcasts. I also use comics a lot, but that you got to have an affinity for comics, I feel, to wade into that realm.
Absolutely. Well, someone wants your Venmo so that they can reimburse you for your resource list. But a question in the Q&A is, what do you think is the biggest way people can make a difference in breaking the binary?
Yeah. So I would say if you're somebody who lives outside of the gender binary, being fully who you are and knowing the history of people that have come before you is really important. If you're somebody that is cisgender, I think that changing your language to allow for space of a diversity of gender. So to change your language so that there's not an expectation of a binary gender structure, and that can be simply saying, not saying, ladies and gentlemen, or like all of these things that we fall into these social scripts of thinking that this is the only way we can be polite, right? I get this question a lot in the work that I do, especially in the South. I want to be polite to people. Why can't I say thank you, ma'am, and thank you, sir, or things like that? And I don't want to assume gender. And I say, why is that the only expectation of politeness? Like is that the only way we can show that we're deferential to our elders? I feel like that's very narrow. We're more creative than that as people. And so be creative. Start thinking about other ways to express gratitude or welcome in a more open and plural way. And you can do that by changing your language.
Melissa Faircloth writes, Director of the American Indian and Indigenous Community Center here at VT, sometimes we see Indigenous communities through years of colonization absorb Western views of gender and sexuality. It's of course complicated because there are victims of colonization, but suffering may be inflicted on their own community members by no longer accepting gender nonconforming persons. Also, you said not all tribes had multiple gender identities identified, and it varies a great deal. This is my long-winded way of asking about approaches for Indigenous peoples to eradicate phobias in our own communities.
Yeah, so this is something that I'm actually currently grappling with my own tribal community, and that my tribe does not recognize any other gender but male or female. And we've been so inculcated with Christianity and white supremacy that even the person who is the tribal leader is actually a Baptist minister. So it is really difficult and especially for somebody like me, I've never lived in the traditional lands of my people. And so I'm trying to go to my elders with respect and ask them to share community knowledge with me, and ask, like, I want to be a part of ceremony and stuff. But as a trans person, as a non-binary person, I don't fit in. I can't participate in the ceremonies for men. I can't participate in the ceremonies they want me to participate in the ceremonies for women, but I don't want to, right? That's not my true self and being. So trying to balance having respect for your elders and asking them for that wisdom and knowledge while also pushing them to evolve and grow is really hard. That's a fine balance. So I've really found starting my own community. So I found 2 or 3 other Two-Spirit folks within the Lipan Apache community. And so we started our own language class, and we meet up every now and again. We're Facebook friends. We share stories. We've started a specific chat just for Two-Spirit people within Indigenous communities that are not recognized, right? So we've started to create our own systems of support, our own knowledge. We've started to explore ceremonies together. I haven't done this yet because of COVID stuff, but people have come together and created their own Two-Spirit ceremonies based on what little information we have from our ancestors, right? And so I encourage folks to try and do that. Try to create space and insist on existing, but also be deferential to your elders. So they know we exist as a group. And we sort of said, we're doing this. And they said, okay, I guess. And we are, but occasionally we butt heads with trying to get them to share some knowledge with us. So it can be really, really hard. And I'll tell you, Indigenous communities in the U.S. have a harder time with this oftentimes, generally speaking, than Indigenous communities in Canada. So for whatever reason, for a lot of reasons, But colonialization looked a little different in Canada, right? So there was some more things that were left intact. And here in the U.S. and in Mexico, actually, there was a targeted elimination. And that happened in Canada too. It was just a bit differently done. So depending on where you are, it looks very different. And that is putting aside that there's different language, there's different terms from community to community, right? So it can vary quite a bit. I hope that answered the question. I rambled a little bit. You rambled with your question. I rambled with my answer. Hopefully we met in the middle and we got an answer.
Like me liked. I like it. We'll do one last question just to be mindful of time. Thanks for this incredibly valuable presentation. This question refers to your emphasis on naming. I definitely agree that naming creates awareness. What can you recommend in terms of avoiding a kind of naming that states, this system victimizes me, when but then gets kind of stuck in solely talking about oppression and blame to the degree that thinking about change itself doesn't seem possible in that space or time?
Yeah. So I think that there's a way to name things in naming it for yourself, and talking about your own experience with systems of oppression, and using that first person language is really important in that. And so I find that I use the language of, you might not be experiencing this, but because of who I am experiencing this. And sometimes that can be helpful in describing things that you're experiencing that maybe other people aren't seeing or aren't experiencing, right? Because even though we can be people of color, we can even get all indigenous people together, or all Latinx people, right? Or all Black people. We're still all going to have very different experiences, depending on where we grew up, our age, how much whiteness was forced upon us, right? And so the way that I interact with white supremacy is very different, because I was raised thinking that I was white. I was raised erasing who I was. And so I have some of that unlearning to do. Whereas other folks who are indigenous or Latinx, sorry, someone's car alarm is going off. They might not have that unlearning process to do. And so their exploration or experiencing of white supremacy can look very, very different. So I think naming it as, this is the way I experience it, it might be different for you, could be helpful. I hope that answered the question.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. Folks also want to know if you don't mind sharing your PowerPoint presentation. We're basically just going to package this up and send it back.
I love it.
Awesome.
Listen, I am not a trademark type of person. Anything I do, I give. So yes, please.
Love you for it, pal. Well, thank you so much for your time and your genius, as always. It is an absolute gift and a joy to spend this time with you. So thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Thanks everybody for coming. Yeah.
Of course. Take care, drink water, stay safe, wear masks, and we'll see you soon. Bye, folks.